Tiberias region, Magdala. But the Catholics made her into this penitent Mary. And now they're trying to unmake her. This Dominican woman, Dr. Barbara Reed, is saying, no, that was all just an invention by the popes. She's a Dominican saying that. Then you have the Cathar Mary, who I've described in some detail. She's the Gnostic Mary. Then you have the Orthodox Mary, the Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Church. They have a slightly different theology of Mary. And they have a church to Mary Magdalene in the Mount of Olives region, outside the Golden Gate in East Jerusalem, which I've been to. Huge church dedicated to Mary Magdalene, which is very sacred to them. They love and reverence Mary Magdalene. They're somewhere between the Gnostic and the Catholic position, I would say, the Orthodox, because they're quite deep in their spiritual journeying. And places like Mount Athos with their monasteries, they do a lot of deep spiritual inner work, meditational work. And they would see Mary as someone helping with that, I think. Then there's another tradition in Christianity called the Arian tradition, which is different again, which basically argued that this whole basis of Christian orthodoxy and Catholicism was wrong. Christ is not the only incarnate Son of God. Christ is not God walking around in human form. Christ was a very amazing prophet, teacher, spiritual elder, inspired by God, had divine moments, but was a man like any of us. And this tradition, known as Arian Christianity, was preached by Arius, who was very important in the church in Alexandria. And it was very, very important for some 100 years. And there's an irony, is that Constantine the Great, who was baptized as a Christian on his deathbed, he made the church official in the Roman Empire. He was baptized as an Arian Christian by Eusebius, who was an Arian bishop. Because in Constantinople in those days, there were factions fighting, We're going to be Catholic, Orthodox, Arian, Gnostic, And he said, no, I'm going to be Arian. So the Arian church evangelized the whole Gothic nation with Wulfilas, and the first Germanic Bible ever written was written in letters by Wulfilas. And the Goths and the Germans accepted Arian Christianity. And they ruled a lot of Europe, they ruled parts of Spain, right up until the Moorish invasion in 711. And they also were important in the area around Rennes-le-Château, and they also sacked Rome in 414. So these Arian Goths have been written out of history, because history was written by the Roman Catholic historians, who then rose to supremacy when the Franks took over France. The Goths ruled Aquitaine for several centuries. And because they'd captured Rome, it's possible they brought the treasures that they found in Rome. The theory about Mary Magdalene and the link to Rennes-le-Château, some people argue it was because there was a whole Visigothic treasure there, which Saunier found. I don't know, but I think the treasure was the theology the Arians had. Because if Christ wasn't the only Son of God, it was much more like Islam. Islam says the same. Christ was a revealer, a prophet, but not God. That would be a blasphemy. Nobody is God. And in that case, Mary Magdalene is not married to God. It makes it more understandable. They're humans. They had a human relationship. And it's more like a humanistic thing. So anyway, that's the Arian Christian take on it. And that resurfaced in the 18th century with Freemasonry and with the Unitarian Church, who de-divinized Christ. They said, no, we want Christ as a human being. And Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, was accused of secretly being an Arian at Cambridge, because his theology was more, rational than kind of God walking on earth type thing. So we'd have to ask Mary Magdalene herself, which is the real one. The Freemasons themselves are interesting. I've studied them a lot because they're a sort of mystical, rational, scientific sect in 18th century Europe. Britain, France, very important. And they also like Mary Magdalene. There are little lodges all over the place dedicated to her. You know, what do they say? Well, I think they're more rational. They would say Mary is a symbol of women's emancipation. There are women's lodges in London and Paris, where I know women Freemasons, they want equality with the men. And this is about the advancement of human rights has to include women's rights. And they organised that Festival of Reason in Notre Dame Cathedral during the height of the French Revolution as a symbolic thing. You know, and women were acting out the role of the goddess of reason. So Mary Magdalene would fit into that lineage of Freemasonry, perhaps. So those are the denominations, and there are others. The Protestant denomination, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, their take on Mary is, well, she's not that important. Christ is the important thing. Mary's just like a sideshow. Don't bother about Mary. You know, and there are variants of that. Luther said she was the wife of Jesus. Then there's other Marys. Okay, so this is a whistle-stop tour, but the next Mary will be the Mary of Islam. Now there's 2 billion Muslims in the world. That's quite a lot of Muslims. And what do they say about Mary Magdalene? They love Jesus. He's in the Quran. I've done a commentary on the Quran, which I'm just finishing off. They love the Virgin Mary. She's referenced a lot in the Quran. It would appear that Muhammad had never heard of Mary Magdalene. The stories of Mary Magdalene. You see, one of the tragedies of history is the Bible never got to Mecca. The Gospels were never read by Muhammad and his circles. He only got oral traditions, stories of Jesus, stories of Mary, the Virgin Mary, and so on, in a certain kind of desert Gnostic group that included his wife Khadija, who was very influential on his thinking, and but it didn't include Mary Magdalene. There's a complete gap. Nowhere in the Quran, nowhere in Islamic writings, nowhere. And I think this is one of the tragedies of history, because when the French Crusaders were going off to capture Jerusalem from the Muslims, waving their banners of Mary Magdalene, and having the bones of Mary Magdalene found in the south of France, this was all to give the Crusaders a feeling that they were fighting for the goddess, you know, blah, blah. And they built the big basilica at Vézelay, which we went to on pilgrimage a couple of years ago with the Mary Magdalene Studies group, at the time of those crusades. So the Crusaders were using Mary Magdalene as a sort of standard to say we're God's chosen army. The Muslims just didn't know what they were talking about. What is this Mary Magdalene nonsense? You know, like, you're all heretics. Jesus wasn't divine, wasn't the Son of God, there's no Trinity, and he was just a prophet. And we've got the latest prophet, Muhammad, so we are better than you, so we are going to kill you lot. And it's been a war going on ever since. When you see terrorist attacks by Islamists anywhere in the Western world, I always think, God, you know, I wish they'd studied Mary Magdalene a bit more, you know, because it makes them a bit more sensitive to the Western mystery traditions and the feminine, the lost feminine at the heart of Western Christianity. So there's a dialogue there needed. And it's interesting that this happened at Rennes-le-Château in the church recently. A Muslim activist, an Islamic extremist, smashed the statue of the devil in the church at Rennes-le-Château, crying Allah Akbar. You know, it's like a religious war going on. All I'm saying is let's sit down and convert this war into a religious striving for truth. I'd love to sit down with the greatest contemporary Islamic scholars and go through all the hadith, all the teachings of Muhammad, all the Quran, and all the philosophical commentaries on the Quran, the tafsir, of which I'm doing one, to say, where is Mary Magdalene? And why not? Why isn't she there? One of the paradoxes is Muhammad loved women, and he had wives aplenty. Muhammad, as a prophet, no problem about having wives. He had, you know, quite a few of them, officially and legally. And Muslims are allowed up to 4 Muslim men. You know, they love wives. So why wasn't Jesus allowed a wife? I think that a Muslim theologian should get onto the Mary Magdalene story and realise they're on a winner here. This is a route to peace between Islam and Christianity. If it turns out, yes, Jesus had a wife, she was called Mary Magdalene, then I think the Muslims would be really happy. It'd be like a whole story they didn't know. It would like, oh, then Jesus was almost as good as Muhammad, you know. So we can make peace. I would love to make peace between Jesus and Muhammad. It's one of my goals in the work I'm doing as a peace scholar. Okay, moving on, we come to Judaism, the Mary of Judaism. She's also there, and there are many Jewish, modern-day feminist Jewish thinkers reclaiming Mary as a Jewess. They're saying, because she was brought up as a Jew, and she observed the festivals, the rituals, she would have lit the candles on the Sabbath. She was a good Jewish woman, you know. And Miriam, Mary, is named after Miriam, the sister of Moses. So her family must have been Jewish. And so they're saying, well, let's have her back for Judaism. And I know lots of Jewish friends in Israel contemporarily living there, or scattered around the world, who are exploring the Kabbalah, esoteric Judaism. And I think it's very likely that Mary Magdalene was exploring that too, those Jewish mysteries called the Kabbalah. I think Jesus was teaching from that perspective. I've studied the Kabbalah for 30 years and I've met many great Kabbalist teachers. It's a fascinating subject and it means receivings. And I'm sure that that's what Mary Magdalene and Jesus were talking about when they chatted. Her nickname, the Tower, Magdala, the Tower, is a town, but also I think it refers to an ascended station of consciousness. She was like a tower for the disciples. And that refers to the Sephirot of the Kabbalah, which is the design of the Tree of Life. So anyway, Jesus and Mary, in their Jewish context, studying esoteric Judaism, also Enochian traditions, because Enoch was the prophet who predated Moses and brought many esoteric teachings. It's certain that the early Christian community, including Jesus, had studied the books of Enoch. Enoch 1, there are 3 of them. Definitely read Enoch 1. I've proved it in my commentary. So this is very interesting stuff. We need more Jewish thinkers to study Mary Magdalene as a Jewish thinker. Then we come to the Mary Magdala of pagans. And lo and behold, of course, there are pagans saying, no, she was a pagan. No, she wasn't Jewish or certainly not Christian. You know, the word wasn't even used by Christ at the time. She was a pagan. And that was why she was kind of heretical, because she was a secret goddess worshipper within Galilee, Canaan, Israel, at a time when the official religion was very anti the goddess and anti-women. Now there's a brilliant novel, one of the books in the collection of Mary Magdalene Studies, by Marion Kunstler, who puts all this together, fictional form, called The Moon Under Her Feet. She has Mary Magdalene as a priestess initiate in Jerusalem, in the temple, a devotee of Asherah, who's the wife of Yahweh. Why shouldn't Yahweh have a wife? If Jesus is allowed a wife, God's got to have a wife, the goddess. I mean, this is not a problem in Hinduism or the Druid tradition. The Celts, their gods have, you know, they come as a couple. And any self-respecting God needs a goddess to help, you know. So why can't Yahweh have a wife? So she's called Asherah, and Mary Magdalene was her priestess. So when she got together with Jesus, she was teaching him the female mysteries, as he was teaching her the male mysteries. It was like a marriage of equals. That's what the pagans say, and they're very big on this. You know, Wiccans, witches, reclaiming the power of the feminine goddess. They want to reframe the entire story of Mary Magdalene and make her like a high priestess of the pagan mysteries. And there's loads of books and articles coming out about that by pagan scholars. I suspend judgment, you know, on all these. It seems to be there are many Marys. Next we come to the Mary of archaeology, which is interesting. I love archaeology. And they have found some ossuaries around Jerusalem with names on, like Mary, Yeshua, Joseph. They've found a graveyard, like a kind of sepulchre place, with some of these ossuaries have got names that they claim this might be the bones of Mary Magdalene. Again, I suspend judgment, but archaeologists are studying all this stuff, and it's very controversial. Because some people say, no, they're forgeries. Some people say, no, they're real. Others say, well, yes, it says Mary, but that was a very common name. It's not Mary of Magdala. Apparently, a third of the people, of the women in Judea at the time, were called Mary. So it's a common name, right? Then next, there'd be the Mary of history, who is, as a historian myself, what we want to do is look at all the sources, go into the first references, like carbon date the texts, look at what's the chain of evidence for all these sources. Vézelay claims to have some bones belonging to Mary Magdalene. Well, when was the first reference to them coming there? When did they first get to the other place in south of France, the caves near Marseille, where they have the skull of Mary Magdalene? What's the literary sources for historical evidence of that? What about in the Holy Land? Because, again, there are sites associated with Mary Magdalene. Can we research that historically? So there's the Mary of history, who sort of appears in the fog, like in a foggy landscape, and suddenly you see a light here and then a light there. You never pin her down. The Mary of history is very elusive. I've hinted at this before, but I'll just stress it. There are a lot of New Age type tantric teachers around, what I call the Mary of dyadic love theory. So according to them, Tantra is the way to go in life. You have to have a consort and practice, etheric sex with them. And this is what Jesus and Mary Magdalene were doing. So there are people in Glastonbury, it's the mecca of New Ageism, and Findhorn and other places, California, and who are now teaching, Tantra theory, and would say that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were practicing as very high tantric initiates. It's the best and quickest and easiest way to reach enlightenment is with a consort. That's what Tantric Buddhism teaches, and Hindu Tantra as well. So, and there are people trying to explore that path. I've been interviewed. There's a guy in Los Angeles who does a tantric podcast radio show, and he interviewed me about this, like my theories on it. And it's very big stuff in California. Everyone wants to practice this New Age Tantra thing. And Mary Magdalene is their patron saint, because she and Jesus were doing this, so that's why we can know. Well, again, I suspend judgment, but it's very Californian, New Age, and it's interesting. Is it true? I don't know. Does it work? Well, I think it might do, but you have to be very cautious with these. Are very powerful energies. Eros is like nuclear electricity. You don't let it kind of leak in the wrong ways. Okay, then we come to the Mary of transpersonal history, which is what my doctoral thesis is on. As a historian, I said we need a new kind of doing for history. We'll never find Mary Magdalene with just normal history. We can get all the documents that reference her from the beginning of the Christian era to now and stick them in a library and get historians studying them all. We won't find her that way because there isn't enough of a trail, and we have to have more. So it's history plus. We have to have history plus sharpening our noetic intelligence to see between the lines. If we read a document from the 8th century, we have to see who was writing it, why were they writing it, what were their feelings when they were writing it. We have to see history through the lens of transpersonal psychology, is what I'm arguing in my doctoral thesis. And I think if we do transpersonal history, we might begin to see Mary emerging more clearly out of the mist. Then there's the Mary of Peace Studies. I just want to put a plug in for this because as a peace studies practitioner and expert and part of a network of scholars around the planet, what I think is most important to me about the Jesus story and the Mary Magdalene story is they were peace witnesses. Jesus was saying to both the extreme Romans and the extreme Jews, don't fight, don't kill each other. It was absolutely simple. He was saying non-violence is the way. You can't get anywhere on the spiritual path to find God if you're doing violence. And this was exactly what the yogis had been teaching in India since the Upanishad times. In the Upanishad times, 9th century BC, you can't even study yoga unless you renounce violence. You can't become a Buddhist monk unless you renounce violence. You couldn't become a druid in the Celtic traditions unless you renounce violence. This is why there's such a differentiation between the spiritual path and the warrior path. The warriors love their violence. They bash each other with swords, and now it's, drones, and that's a certain type of person, and we all have to grow through that. If you believe in reincarnation, then, as the Druids did, and the Hindus and the Buddhists, then we've all been warriors, right? But now we've grown out of it, and we want to do something which is higher, which is to grasp after truth, as Gandhi said. The truth seeker is the satyagraha, who searches for peace. So from a peace studies perspective, Mary Magdalene and Jesus are important for that. They were pioneers of peace consciousness. And all their spiritual work, I think, was attempting to ground a peace consciousness in society as a whole, which unfortunately didn't completely work. The church didn't live up to it. It became a vehicle of violence with its disputes and fights. And so that's, it was a noble attempt to launch the peace mission. And it's inspired many, many Christians to become peace activists ever since, like the Quakers. And there are Pax Christi is a Catholic-based peace organisation. One of my mother's closest friends, Bruce Kent, is a great peace activist in Britain, campaigning against nuclear weapons. And the Pope, bless him, the Vatican has signed the No Nuclear Weapons Treaty that's been agreed by the UN. It's an official thing. Every nation state can sign up and say, we will not make nuclear weapons or stockpile them. The Vatican has signed it. They're not going to have nuclear weapons in the Vatican, right? Which I love. And loads of Catholic countries have signed it, like the Philippines, El Salvador, lots of the Latin American countries. Behind the scenes, the church is seriously trying to get rid of nuclear weapons on the planet. And I really 100% support them. They're living up to that peace message. Long may it last. And also they've been supporting peace studies in universities like Notre Dame and places. Okay, then there's finally, nearly the end, the Marxist and communist Mary Magdalene. This is an interesting take. Because in the revolutionary era, as I said, they got rid of the church. It was seen as ridiculous. But they kept the folk image of Marianne in France, the heroic, fighter for justice. And in the communist tradition, Mary Magdalene is seen as a warrior for truth. She's the female rebel rouser who's fighting for peace and justice for the poor. In their tradition, Christ is a spokesman for the poor, which I think he also was. And so in their view, communism was the logical extension of history. And Mary Magdalene and Jesus are important because they're way-showers towards an egalitarian world in which men and women, rich and poor, can live happily. Communist utopia. And a sort of revolutionary leader. And, that was an important tradition in its own right. And still has resonance. People in downtrodden parts of the world, like in Latin America, where they've been influenced by liberation theology, which is a big thing in the church, particularly in Latin America. They would see Mary as almost like a secret revolutionary, like organising the Jesus explosion. And it might be true. And finally, we come to the last of the many Marys, and no doubt you can think of your own. The last of the many Marys is what I call the Mary of philosophy. What is the Mary of philosophy? Well, she would be the integrated many Marys, somehow synthesized. I mean, one of my great heroes as a philosopher is Hegel. The reason I like Hegel is because he synthesized everything into a meta system of logic. So for me, the Mary of philosophy, I don't know if Hegel ever wrote about Mary Magdalene. He wrote about Jesus quite a lot, and he loved him. But he wanted to explain him. He thought Jesus didn't really understand what he was doing. Only philosophy can really explain. He was bringing the absolute Geist, the absolute spirit, into incarnation through the consciousness of the individual. We all do that to some extent. Jesus did it in a mega way, and Mary Magdalene was part of that. And I think that Hegel was trying to explain the many Marys and bring them into a sort of integrity. Nowadays, if we update that through modern philosophy, then that's a job to be done. I don't know many philosophers in the contemporary world who've looked at the Mary Magdalene story. Most of them don't even bother to look at Christianity, but there are some. And, Tillich was a great thinker. There's an existentialist Christian tradition that I also have sympathy with. I've written a huge work called Being and Knowledge, which is my response to Heidegger's Being and Time and Sartre's Being and Nothingness. I've argued in my book that being and knowledge is the crucial conversation. And in that saga, what was the knowledge that was being exchanged by Mary Magdalene and Jesus? That's the important question. And that would be the Mary of philosophy. And I think, my intuition is that if Mary Magdalene was in this room, she would be a very intelligent woman. She'd understand everything I've just said, and she could then explain who she really was. Yes, I'm all that, she would say, and more. So I think the Mary of philosophy is I think she was an intelligent, highly educated woman, as I think Christ was as well. You don't get to be a teacher at that level unless you've served your apprenticeship and studied in depth. So, and that's my sort of ending of this section, which is to say that I think that's why she's important. She represents to me the quintessence of that attempted reconciliation between Hellenistic, sophisticated thought and Hermetic traditions and Jewish Kabbalistic traditions, and probably indigenous Canaanite, Phoenician type things. They were working on a mega-synthesis, just as we are now. And so by giving honour to her and Jesus, we're giving, hopefully, a boost to our own mission now in 21st century, which is still a peace mission. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. We'll break and have lunch and questions, okay? If you want to turn things off.